I never imagined my marriage would end with a single slip of paper falling out of my husband's Bible. For 10 years, I had played the role of the devoted wife, the woman the whole town pointed to as an example. Yet in one heartbeat, all of that collapsed. Scrawled in hurried ink were 7 words that cut deeper than any blade. If she finds out, silence her for good. That night, while the church choir sang about grace and salvation, I stood frozen with the note in my hand, realizing the man I trusted most might already be plotting my disappearance. And that's where my story begins. At the exact moment when loyalty turned into betrayal. When a marriage built on appearances shattered into fear and suspicion. My name is Evelyn King, and I am 71 years old. Age has given me silver hair and slower steps, but memory carries me back with startling clarity. 3 decades ago, when I was 34, living in a small town in Yakima Valley, Washington, I believed I had a perfect life. Vineyards spread across the hills, apple orchards sweetened the air, and our red brick church stood proudly in the center of it all. My days were filled with routines that seemed steady and safe. Baking before dawn, selling pies at the market by noon, quilting with the women of the church in the afternoons. Robert, my husband, was admired as a leader. He managed the Bethany Relief Fund, wore sharp suits, and spoke with the authority of a man people trusted. Our 2 children were bright and well-behaved, completing the picture everyone pointed to as an example. To neighbors, we were the kind of family others longed to be, but perfection hides its fractures. One Sunday morning, while tidying the church storage room, I lifted a stack of books. Robert's Bible slipped from my hands, thudding against the wooden floor. From its pages, a folded scrap of paper fluttered down. I picked it up, expecting a sermon note or a comforting verse. Instead, jagged handwriting delivered a message that froze my blood. If she finds out, silence her. The choir's voices rose in hymns of grace, but all I heard was the thunder inside my chest. My hands trembled, my vision blurred, and I pressed the paper to my chest as though I could stop its words from cutting any deeper. Who was she? What secret demanded such a chilling command? The Bible, a book of faith, had become a hiding place for menace. That morning, I slipped the paper into my pocket, walked back into the sanctuary, and smiled as though nothing had happened. Yet I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones, that the life I thought unshakable had already begun to collapse. 30 years later, I can still feel the moment when trust broke and fear began. After the shock of that Sunday morning, I could no longer look at my husband the same way. Every habit of Robert's seemed sharpened into suspicion. He was gone the first Thursday of every month without fail. He locked his desk drawers with a care that felt excessive. His late-night phone calls ended abruptly when I entered the room, and his eyes slipped away from mine as though the truth might escape if he held my gaze too long. One evening, while emptying the pockets of his overcoat before washing, I found a crumpled receipt. It was from Spokane, for a diamond ring worth nearly half of our household's annual expenses. My hands froze. I had never seen such a ring on my finger, nor on anyone else's in our home. The note in the Bible flashed through my memory like a wound reopened. My chest tightened as I folded the slip back into place, forcing myself to steady my breath. Days later, while reviewing the Bethany Relief Fund records, something I had helped file before, I noticed figures that didn't add up. A large transfer had been routed into a company called Ridgefield Development, a name unfamiliar to most, but tied unmistakably to Franklin Sutter, the fund's director and Robert's closest ally. At a town meeting, Franklin stood before the community, voice full of confidence as he described a riverfront renewal project. His words flowed smoothly, but the numbers on the page whispered a different story. In the church choir loft, my eyes landed on Lila Torres, a young teacher of 27. A diamond ring gleamed on her hand, new and dazzling. People whispered that a well-dressed man collected her every Thursday. One winter night, as the choir dispersed into the cold, I caught a glimpse of her palm resting protectively over her belly. Her expression wasn't one of joy, but of unease. The pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't only the relief fund being siphoned dry. Robert was preparing another life, another family. The note from the Bible returned in full clarity. If she finds out, silence her. Now I knew exactly who she was. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen. The wind howled through the eaves. The fire snapped in the stove, but inside me there was only a frozen stillness. My children slept down the hall. Unaware that their world had begun to fracture, I knew then I could not confront Robert head-on. To do so would be to invite disaster. Instead, I made a quiet vow. I would dig deeper, and I would uncover everything he was trying to hide. I kept smiling at the market, because smiling was the armor everyone expected of me. By day I stacked pies on a gingham cloth, traded small talk with the farmers, laughed with the quilting women as we compared stitch patterns. No one guessed that at night I became a different woman, quiet, deliberate, methodical. I bought a cheap film camera in the next town and learned how to move without making a sound. When Robert slept, I crept into his study and photographed ledger pages, faded receipts, and the loose memos he tucked into folders. Each click of the shutter felt like scoring a tally against the facade he'd built. The quilting circle helped without knowing the real reason. I told them I was making an album of the church's relief work. They photocopied reports and fed sheets into their scanner under the pretense of preserving memories. I wrapped the copies in clean tissue and sewed them into the lining of a donation tote that looked like every other library bag in town. The plan was simple and brazen. Hand that tote to the boarding house owner who received visitors, and she would, unknowingly, forward it to the state inspector Dana Brooks when she arrived for her scheduled audit. Living the double life was exhausting. I kept my meals ready, put a warm plate on the table when Robert came home, and listened as he spoke in the soft, practiced tones he used at meetings. He grew more careful, drawers latched, phone calls taken in the car, those odd, hushed conversations that ended when I stepped through the door. Sometimes he would startle at the sound of my keys, as if he'd been caught in the act. Then one night, everything shifted. Robert set down his fork, drew me close at the kitchen table, and for the first time in months, he praised me openly, thanked me for keeping the family together, held our children in his arms longer than usual. Eyes suddenly bright with something like regret. To everyone else it was tenderness. To me it read like a goodbye practiced in advance. In that held breath I understood the danger. He was preparing to leave, and if I pushed too loud, I might be the one silenced. I lay awake that night with the camera under my pillow, pulse loud in the dark, knowing there was no turning back. The town hall in Yakima was packed to the walls, the air thick with damp coats and nervous anticipation. Franklin Sutter, sharp in his tailored suit, stood at the podium, his voice firm and steady. He pointed to colorful charts and polished diagrams, painting visions of a riverfront resort that would supposedly lift the valley from hardship. Every figure he displayed gleamed with perfection. Every word he spoke sounded like a promise of salvation. People leaned forward, clinging to the hope he dangled before them. From the back row, Evelyn watched in silence, her notebook balanced across her lap. She copied the numbers, but each one felt like a lie carved into paper. She knew what those figures meant. Money meant for broken families had already been drained away, reshaped into false investments. Now the very people who had lost everything in the flood were being tricked into selling their land for next to nothing. Their desperation twisted into opportunity. When the meeting dissolved into polite applause, Evelyn slipped out into the fog. The parking lot shimmered under pale lamps, her breath clouding the cold night air. She was almost to her car when she saw her. Lila Torres stood beneath the yellow light, her coat wrapped tight, one hand resting gently over her stomach. Evelyn's instinct reached her before caution could intervene. "You're expecting, aren't you?" she whispered. The young woman froze. For a heartbeat, Evelyn expected a smile, a nod, some small flicker of joy. Instead, Lila's eyes filled, her lips quivered, and she looked away as if someone might be listening in the shadows. The sight struck Evelyn like a mirror held up to her own fear. Lila wasn't radiant with happiness, she was terrified. In that moment, Evelyn understood. This girl was not a willing partner in Robert's secret life. She was trapped by his promises, bound in the same web of lies, and her dread matched Evelyn's own. Two women, different in every way yet caught in the same dangerous game, now stood side by side in silence beneath the fog. A few days later, as Evelyn stepped out of the church, she stopped cold. Her car's tires sagged in shreds of rubber, and across her front door someone had sprayed the words in dripping red. "Trash digger." The warning was no longer hidden in paper or whispers. It was out in the open now, painted for all to see. Robert or Franklin, or both, had begun to suspect her. That same afternoon, the town sirens wailed. News swept through Yakima. The dam upstream was releasing water, and the valley braced for another flood. Panic rippled through the streets as families packed in haste, children crying, the sound of engines mixing with the rising rain. Evelyn held her children's hands tight, her voice calm though her chest ached with dread. She led them home with steady steps, the weight of fear pressing down harder than the storm. Night fell under sheets of pounding rain. The roof shook with each gust of wind, and Evelyn sat rigid at the table, listening. Then, 3 knocks, sharp against the door. She rose, heart hammering, and pulled it open. Lila Torres stood there, soaked through, shivering in her heavy coat. In her arms she clutched a crumpled paper bag stuffed with medical files and overdue bills. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "I have nowhere else to go. He promised me when the money came, he'd take us away. But I know now I was never more than a piece on his board. I need help." Evelyn didn't answer at first. She simply stepped aside and let the young woman in, then reached for a quilt she had stitched by hand. Draping it over Lila's shoulders, she felt the girl's trembling begin to ease. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, silence stretched between them until it turned into understanding. 2 women who should have been enemies, one the wife, the other the mistress, looked at each other and saw the same truth reflected back. Both betrayed, both endangered. In that storm-lashed night, Evelyn and Lila became something neither had expected. Not rivals, but allies. And together, they would have to find a way to survive. Rain veiled Yakima in a thin gray sheet. The river swelled against its banks, and muddy water licked at the streets. The whole valley felt tense, as if holding its breath for a storm that hadn't yet broken. This was the day the Bethany Relief Fund would release its final, enormous payment. The day Ridgefield Development would seize the land by the river. Robert left early in his press suit, his tie knotted with precision. At the door, he told Evelyn not to wait for dinner. A line delivered with the practiced calm of a man rehearsing his escape. Franklin was already at town hall, voice booming with reassurance. His leather briefcase heavy with doctored papers meant to disguise theft as progress. Evelyn carried something different. In her quilted bag lay the photographs she had taken, the bank slips, the receipts, and the letter she had written to explain it all. Each stitch of that bag was her promise to herself. The truth was hers to deliver, and she would not let it be buried. When Franklin poised his pen above the contract, Evelyn stepped forward. Her voice was steady, her hands unshaking as she set the bundle down on the table. "Before a single signature is made," she said, "these records must be reviewed. They prove that relief money was diverted illegally." The room erupted in gasps and frantic whispers. Chairs scraped, papers fluttered. Then the doors opened wide, and Inspector Dana Brooks entered with 2 state officers, the order of seizure already in hand. In the chaos, Robert's mask cracked. He gripped Lila's arm and pulled her toward the side exit, shoving a packet of forged passports into her hands. He thought he could slip away while attention was fixed on Franklin. But the officers were waiting, and the sight stopped the crowd cold. The man once celebrated as a pillar of integrity, trying to flee with his mistress, leaving behind his wife, his children, and the very town that had trusted him. In that single moment, the image Robert had cultivated for years collapsed, and as he was led out in handcuffs, Evelyn stood tall, the weight of her bag suddenly lighter. Knowing the truth had finally spoken for itself, Evelyn's strike had shattered the scheme completely. In the same hall where the townspeople had once applauded their leaders, Franklin was forced into handcuffs, his protest drowned out by the shock of the crowd. Robert followed soon after, escorted between officers. His head bowed against the storm of stares, some disbelieving, others seething with betrayal. By evening, newspapers carried headlines in bold type, "Bethany Relief Fund Scandal." The story spread across the valley like wildfire, burning away the illusion of a man and a church that had seemed untouchable. The red brick church, once the heart of Yakima, could no longer claim innocence. A banner stretched across its entrance, an apology to the community. The relief fund was frozen, its remaining money promised back to families still reeling from the flood. For Evelyn, those numbers meant little. What mattered most was that she and her children had stepped out of the shadows of deceit, safe from the grip of men who thought they could gamble with her life. A month later, the gavel fell in court. Franklin received a long sentence, his influence gone in an instant. Robert, too, was condemned, the image of the model deacon obliterated under the weight of his crimes. Evelyn did not linger for the gossip or the whispers of pity. She packed quickly, gathered her 2 children, and with Lila, who now carried a child of her own, they left Yakima behind. In Spokane, they found a modest house with a garage barely big enough for their plans. Together they stripped it bare and rebuilt it into something new. A quilting workshop and a small bakery they named Rill and Thread. By day, Evelyn stitched with steady hands, each seam stronger than the last. By night, Lila kept the books, welcomed customers, and counted every coin like a promise. What began as scraps, fragments of fabric, fractured lives, slowly took form. The quilts pieced together warmth from what once seemed useless, just as the women themselves pieced together a future from betrayal and ruin. Once rivals, they now moved side by side, bound not by resentment but by survival. And, in time, by a sisterhood no storm could tear apart. Years passed, and time softened the sharpest edges of pain. What once had been a wound became a scar, not to erase the past, but to prove survival. Out of betrayal and ruin rose a place where broken fragments found new meaning, where scraps of cloth, like scraps of life, were stitched into something whole. Each quilt became more than fabric, it became testimony, a reminder that even the smallest pieces, when bound with care, could shelter and warm again. One autumn afternoon, sunlight slanted through tall windows, gilding the quiet room in gold. On the wall hung a frame holding a fragile scrap of paper, its ink faded with years. No longer a threat, no longer a shadow, it now stood as a marker of transformation. What once spoke of fear had become a symbol of resilience, a silent witness to the journey from despair to renewal. In the end, every story of survival teaches the same truth, that strength is not the absence of suffering, but the choice to rise after being struck down. That freedom is not simply walking away from chains, but daring to build a life where dignity cannot be taken. And that even when trust is broken, compassion can rethread the seams, binding what seemed beyond repair. Thank you for walking through this journey. If the story moved you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, and join by following or subscribing for more stories that remind us of the quiet power of truth, resilience, and hope.